In the aftermath of World War II, as the echoes of gunfire faded and the dust of the battlefield settled, one of the most imposing remnants of the war began to meet its uncertain fate: the massive concrete flak towers that had once pierced the sky over German cities. Constructed as a response to Allied air raids, these towering structures were designed to provide defensive firepower, but by the time the war ended, they had already become symbols of the destruction they were intended to prevent. In the years following the war, the flak towers faced the daunting task of surviving a new kind of battle, one against time, economic pressures, and an uncertain future. By the end of the war in 1945, the flak towers, colossal fortifications built to withstand the most intense bombardments, had already served their purpose in a manner neither they nor their creators had ever anticipated. The main cities of the Reich had seen the full force of the Allied bombing campaigns. Berlin, Hamburg, and Vienna, among others, had become literal and figurative craters, reeling from the constant air raids. The flak towers, which were intended to defend the cities against these very attacks, had become silent sentinels amidst the rubble. But in the post-war world, these remnants of war no longer had a function to serve. Germany's economy was shattered, industry was crippled, and the country was divided, both politically and physically. The immediate post-war period was a time of severe resource scarcity, as both the civilian population and the occupying powers focused on rebuilding what had been lost. In cities like Berlin, where the flak towers loomed large, the rebuilding process had to start from the ground up. The towering concrete behemoths, once symbols of military might and resistance, were now costly and redundant. Their military purpose had evaporated, and with it, their value to the post-war German state. The primary reason for their rapid obsolescence was the sheer scale of their construction. Standing between 35 and 50 meters high and built with thick, reinforced concrete, the flak towers had been designed to withstand aerial bombardment and serve as a base for anti-aircraft guns, housing up to 10,000 troops at their peak. But by 1945, the strategic need for such structures had all but disappeared. The Allied air superiority had rendered them largely ineffective, and Germany's once thriving industrial base had been all but destroyed. The towers were simply too costly to maintain in a time of scarcity. Beyond military obsolescence, the towering presence of the flak towers in the newly divided Germany presented another issue. As the Allies took control of the defeated nation, the question of what to do with the remnants of Germany's war machine became a pressing concern. The towers, constructed in strategic locations throughout the country, now stood as heavy, entrenched markers of wartime aggression. Their very existence seemed to demand action, whether through destruction, repurposing, or abandonment. In the immediate post-war years, dismantling or scrapping the towers seemed a logical course of action for the Allies, who were intent on denazifying Germany and removing its capacity for future military aggression. The sheer size of the towers, however, made this an exceedingly difficult task. While some of the towers had been destroyed by Allied bombings or collapsed under the weight of time, many still stood tall, scattered across the urban landscapes. To simply demolish them was a costly endeavor, both in terms of labor and materials, resources that were in short supply. Moreover, there was the issue of their symbolic weight. The flak towers were not only military installations, they were monuments to the war itself. In a country reeling from the consequences of Nazi aggression, the towers became painful reminders of the past. Yet, the question remained: should they be eradicated altogether or repurposed in some way? Some factions believed that they should be torn down immediately to leave no trace of the regime that had built them. Others, however, saw the towers as valuable pieces of infrastructure worthy of adaptation. The occupying Allied forces were quick to act on the matter of these structures. In Berlin, where some of the largest and most prominent flak towers stood, early post-war decisions were made to dismantle or repurpose them. The British, who were in control of parts of the city, focused on clearing away remnants of the war, including military fortifications, as part of a broader effort to demilitarize Germany. Yet, even here, the task was not as simple as it appeared. The towers, often built to withstand direct strikes, proved resilient against attempts at demolition. The financial cost of clearing them was too high, and the labor required to break down these massive structures was too great. By the late 1940s, it became apparent that the immediate destruction of the towers was not a practical solution. Meanwhile, the economic realities of post-war Germany began to shift. The country's industrial capacity had been decimated, and the focus turned to recovery and rebuilding. In this context, many flak towers found themselves abandoned, their once pristine concrete shells slowly being overtaken by nature or urban decay. In Berlin, where several towers had been constructed, local residents took to using them as makeshift shelters. As construction efforts focused on housing and critical infrastructure, the towers, while abandoned, became essential to the survival of civilians in the fractured city. Elsewhere in Germany, some towers were repurposed for different uses. The most notable example was the Flak Tower in Hamburg. Here, the massive structure was converted into a public air raid shelter, offering protection to civilians during the post-war years when the threat of further air raids, though reduced, still loomed. The tower's sheer size made it suitable for this purpose, and its concrete walls offered some semblance of security in a time of great uncertainty. Similarly, in Vienna, another tower was converted into a radio tower. Its high elevation and fortified structure made it an ideal location for broadcasting. Yet, while some towers found new uses, others were left to slowly deteriorate. The cost of maintaining these aging structures, many of which were located in prime real estate areas, became a growing concern. As the 1950s rolled in, the German government, under pressure from the occupying forces and its own economic realities, began to address the fate of these monolithic structures. However, the solution was not immediately clear. In some cases, the towers were allowed to fade into the urban fabric, becoming forgotten relics of a bygone era. Over time, they began to blend into the cityscape, their historical significance overshadowed by the immediate needs of the post-war world. While the broader effort to clear out remnants of the Nazi war machine continued, the Flak towers, so deeply embedded in the urban environment, were left to linger. It was clear that the massive concrete Flak towers were no longer symbols of military strength or technological innovation. Instead, they had become burdens on the landscape, overshadowing the very cities they had once been designed to defend. The question of whether these towers should be preserved, demolished, or repurposed continued to loom large in post-war Germany's rebuilding efforts. The fate of the towers was still unfolding, their eventual role uncertain. Would they become historical landmarks or simply be lost to time, forgotten in the push to rebuild a new Germany? This was a question that could not yet be answered as the country navigated the complex, fraught path of recovery. After the initial post-war years had passed, the fate of the massive concrete Flak towers seemed less clear. Though the towers had stood as icons of Nazi military ambition during the war, their future in the rapidly changing world of the late 1940s and 1950s was anything but certain. The physical and economic burden they represented weighed heavily on post-war Germany, a nation still recovering from the devastation of total war. Yet, while some towers were demolished, repurposed, or abandoned, others would linger in the urban fabric of the country, becoming enduring reminders of the war's destructive legacy. As the 1950s unfolded, Germany's landscape was changing dramatically. The division of the country into East and West had created two distinct political entities, each pursuing its own economic recovery. In West Germany, under the influence of the United States and its European allies, a policy of rapid reconstruction took shape, known as the Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle. The process involved rebuilding key industrial sectors, restoring infrastructure, and attracting foreign investment. For these reasons, the massive concrete Flak towers, which were often located in prime urban real estate areas, became more of an obstacle to development than a potential asset. The rising demand for housing, office space, and commercial infrastructure meant that the Flak towers, often situated near city centers, had to be dealt with swiftly. In many cases, the towers in West Germany, particularly those in Berlin and Hamburg, were eventually demolished. In Berlin, the towering structures that once housed anti-aircraft guns and thousands of soldiers were torn down or buried in the rubble of the post-war cityscape. However, even in the midst of such destruction, a few Flak towers managed to survive, often by sheer accident or a quirk of urban planning. One of the most notable examples of a Flak tower's transformation during this period was the case of the Flak Tower in Vienna. Unlike its counterparts in Germany, this tower found a unique repurposing. In the early 1950s, it was transformed into a broadcasting tower for Austrian national radio. The Austrian government, eager to restore a sense of normalcy and communication in the post-war years, saw the tower's massive size and its strategic location as an advantage. Although its original military purpose was long gone, the tower's resilience and durability meant it could be adapted to serve a peaceful civilian function. Over time, as the city of Vienna recovered, the Flak Tower became an unlikely symbol of post-war resilience. It stood as a monument not to the wartime past, but to the country's capacity to rebuild and repurpose the remnants of the old world. The fact that such a structure, built for destruction, could be so effectively adapted for peaceful purposes became a testament to Austria's ability to move beyond the war. It remained a functional broadcast tower for decades, broadcasting national radio programs to the city and beyond. This was, in some respects, a triumph of peaceful repurposing over the looming shadow of wartime violence. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the tower's survival took a different trajectory. While some Flak towers in the city were demolished during the reconstruction phase of the late 1940s and early 1950s, others were incorporated into the fabric of the city's ongoing development. These towers were not simply erased from the landscape. In many cases, they became part of the everyday life of Berlin's citizens. One of the largest Flak towers, located in the district of Friedrichshain, remained intact, despite plans to demolish it. The tower, while not used for its original military purpose, stood as a physical relic of the war. Over the years, it became an urban curiosity, a grim, monolithic reminder of the past that Berliners passed by each day. In the 1960s, the Berlin Flak Tower was repurposed yet again, though not for commercial or governmental use. Instead, it was transformed into a cultural space. The Flak Tower in Friedrichshain, which had originally housed anti-aircraft guns and thousands of soldiers, was turned into a community center. The brutalist structure, once associated with destruction, became a venue for local events, cultural exhibitions, and, in some instances, youth programs. The tower had become a paradox. A place that had once embodied violence and war was now being used to foster peace and community. This transformation was emblematic of the broader shifts in post-war German society, where people sought to distance themselves from the horrors of the past while incorporating elements of it into their modern lives. However, not all Flak towers were so fortunate. In many cases, especially in the more industrialized regions of West Germany, these imposing concrete structures were seen as eyesores, remnants of a dark chapter in history that needed to be erased. As West Germany underwent rapid economic recovery and sought to project an image of modernity, the Flak towers became symbols of a bygone era that was at odds with the new, vibrant economy. In many urban centers, these towers were dismantled or buried beneath new developments, leaving little trace of their existence. In East Germany, under the Soviet-backed communist regime, the fate of the Flak towers was different. The socialist government, which had its own vision for post-war recovery and reconstruction, also grappled with the legacy of Nazi architecture. While some of the towers in East Berlin were repurposed or adapted, others were simply left standing, their fate uncertain. East Germany's emphasis on industrial production and collectivist goals meant that many of the towers found no immediate use in the new political and economic order. Instead, they became inert symbols, reminders of the country's Nazi past that were often ignored or hidden from public view. Yet, even in East Germany, the towers were not completely forgotten. Over time, some of the more prominent structures were integrated into the socialist cityscapes as unusual markers of the country's historical identity. The tower in the Treptow district of Berlin, for example, became a notable landmark, though not for its military significance. Over the years, as the wall that divided East and West Germany took shape, these towers found themselves positioned along the edges of Berlin's political divide, their very presence serving as a physical reminder of the split between East and West. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Flak towers lies in their very survival, or lack thereof. For the towers that were dismantled, The act of destruction became a final chapter in their tumultuous history. In cities like Hamburg, where the towers had once housed thousands of soldiers, demolition teams were brought in during the 1950s to reduce the structures to rubble. This was not simply the removal of physical objects. It was an attempt to erase a painful past, one that had dominated the skyline during the war years. However, these towers, which had been constructed to withstand bombing raids, often proved stubborn in the face of post-war demolition efforts. The task was expensive and labor-intensive, and in many cases, the towers were left to crumble on their own, a quiet testament to the unfulfilled ambitions of the Nazi regime. As the years passed, and the demands of post-war reconstruction receded into history, the Flak towers slowly faded from public consciousness. The last of the towers in Berlin were eventually cleared away in the 1980s, though the concrete relics of the war had never been fully forgotten. Some of them remain in the collective memory of the people who lived through the war and its aftermath, etched into the mental landscape of a generation that had seen both the rise and fall of Nazi Germany. By the time the Cold War came to an end, the Flak towers had long since ceased to be a symbol of military strength or resistance. They had become relics, both burdens and markers of history. While some were repurposed, others were erased from the map, their material existence swallowed up by the forces of urbanization, the weight of time, and the shifting priorities of post-war Europe. Yet, as the last of the towers fell silent, they left behind a story of a country struggling to come to terms with the cost of its past and the daunting task of rebuilding a fractured world.